up for the first panel, okay? So without further ado.
Sarah, thank you very much. You've done a wonderful job. You started speaking and I saw people move away from the coffee and all go sit down, so exactly the right thing to do. Welcome everybody to Vermont Law School. It's an incredible pleasure to have you here and to our 19th annual symposium put on by our law review. You picked a lovely time to be here. I drove up from Norwich. There were big patches of blue sky among the clouds, although it's gotten darker, so who knows? You know what Mark Twain said about the weather in New England, if you don't like it, just wait 5 minutes. But I had a good weather experience. Vermonters like to hedge their bets about the weather. As you probably know, they can be a little bit skeptical. I was at the gas station across the river a couple of weeks ago getting some gas. A guy coming out of the gas station in his coveralls, and I said hello, and he said hello, and I said, nice weather. And he looked at me and he said, so far. So that's Vermont. We're skeptical. So I have the opportunity to attend a lot of events in my role as dean and president of the school, and they're almost always enjoyable, but some are really special because they remind me of why I took this job and why we're all here. Last night, I had the opportunity to have dinner with our panelists who have come to us from so many different places, and I think Colette's going to mention how far afield they have come to us. But I got to listen to our students discuss with them a variety of legal and political issues. Our panelists shared their scholarship and their interests with our students. They shared their experience in writing notes and serving on the journal and in managing a journal. And as I was driving home after that, I thought to myself, this is exactly what a law school should be. This is exactly what an educational institution should be. We have scholars sharing their experience with students who will go on to be scholars and practitioners. So it reminded me a little bit of a quote I heard yesterday from the incoming president of the University of Vermont, Suresh Gilliman, which is from Thomas Jefferson. I just thought it was a great quote, so I'll share it with you. Thomas Jefferson said, "We must dream of an aristocracy of achievement arising out of a democracy of opportunity." I'll just repeat it. It's such a great phrase. We must dream of an aristocracy of achievement arising out of a democracy of opportunity. Well, we're not even close to achieving that democracy of opportunity. You can learn a lot more about that from Marianne's Environmental Justice Clinic if you'd like to know more about that. But the legal enterprise in which we are all participating should be one of the ways in which we strive to both dream and achieve that. So thank you so much for being here today at the symposium. It's really exciting to have you all here. And I'm going to turn it over to the director of our Environmental Law Center, Professor Jenny Rushlow. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean McHenry. So I'm going to take the opportunity to talk a little bit about the Green New Deal that we're all here to learn more about today, and give a little background on this topic and the incredibly rich debate that it has sparked in this country. With mass extinction and millions more refugees removed from their countries as a result of climate pressure and the breakdown of our global food supply as a result of climate change, these are just some of the many reasons why people got together to discuss the Paris Agreement a few years back in an effort to keep global temperature from rising this century more than 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and certainly well below the 2-degree threshold by which damage from climate change would be irreversible. But as we've seen, and as the journalist David Wallace Wells noted in an interview, a 2-degree increase risks 153 million premature deaths from air pollution alone. And 4 years after the Paris Agreement, temperatures are indeed on track to rise at least 3 degrees by 2100. So things are not going well. And it is in light of this reality that Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Ed Markey came forward with the Green New Deal. which many have lauded as being about scale. And as I'm sure we'll hear a lot more about today, the debate about the Green New Deal, is it for real? Is this a doable thing? And as Ocasio-Cortez has noted, the solutions that we have considered big and bold to date are nowhere near the scale that is ultimately going to be required to address this 3-degree rise that we're looking at by the end of the century. And so one thing that she has said that I find really appropriate is people say it's unrealistic. She said, oh, it's unrealistic. Oh, it's vague. Oh, it doesn't address this little minute thing. And I'm like, you try, you do it, which I think really captures the essence of the Green New Deal quite appropriately. And that approach to thinking big has really resonated with a lot of people, including members of the youth movement, who have said the Green New Deal is the only plan put forward to address the interwoven crises of the climate catastrophe, economic inequality, and racism at the scale that science and justice demand. And so if it seems like they're thinking big, they are, because they think this problem merits it. There have been a lot of critiques of this approach. One thing that Representative Ocasio-Cortez has said in this discussion is that in 10 years, we're trying to go carbon neutral. Some would say that's an unreachable goal. Many of our existing climate policies look toward 2050 to go carbon neutral, and many would say even that is unrealistic. Some of the other criticisms that have come forward for the Green New Deal include that for things like transportation and the mass adoption of electrification and high-speed rail, these are not changes that can occur overnight. They're maybe not changes that even can occur in 10 years. And implementation would cost trillions and trillions of dollars, so there's that too. There's the fact that it's a non-binding resolution. Other non-binding resolutions have covered things like congratulating Super Bowl winners, telling the president that Congress disapproves of a particular policy. They're not usually used for sweeping changes to life as we know it, as I guess you could say about the Green New Deal. But this is a new way of thinking, and certainly one could argue that a new problem requires a new way of thinking. I had the opportunity to meet Bill McKibben earlier this year, and he's a journalist by training. He's an icon for climate activists, and as someone who's really driven by law and policy change, and I see that as an opportunity for changing the world, I asked him what he thought was more impactful. Policy change, legal change, or community activism. And he said, without missing a beat, the zeitgeist always comes first. To me, this resolution is activism in policy clothes. Much in the same way as the youth movement, however, it has shaped public opinion and the zeitgeist like few things I've seen in my lifetime. And been incredibly successful in starting a dialogue. And I take Representative Ocasio-Cortez's remarks that if you don't like it, you figure it out to heart. And so I hope that today we will learn more either about how this is workable, or if not, how we'll do it to come up with something better. So I look forward to the dialogue today. Thank you all for being here, and I think we'll get started.
So folks, just make yourselves at home, get comfortable. I'm going to invite our first panelist up to the stage now, and our fearless editor-in-chief is going to give some remarks to introduce this first panel and to thank you all for being here, okay?
Good morning, all. My name is Colette Schmidt, and I am the editor-in-chief of Volume 44 of Vermont Law Review. Welcome to Vermont Law Review's 19th Annual Symposium, Legal Frameworks for a Green New World, Breathing Life into the Goals of the Green New Deal. I would like to spend a couple of moments thanking the people that have worked so hard to put this event together. First, I would like to thank all the panelists for coming from far and wide, as Dean McHenry said, to share their expertise on this relevant topic. We have people coming from as far as Australia, Hawaii, and so forth, and it's really great to see everybody here. I would also like to thank Sarah Puzo and Andrew Hammond for serving as Vermont Law Review's symposium editors and for working hard to put together this renowned event. The Green New Deal has been something that both Sarah and Andrew have wanted to center this event around since preliminary meetings back in February. The Green New Deal is arguably one of the most important forthcoming pieces of legislation in the coming years, though idealistic, and I'm looking forward to hearing each and every one of our renowned panelists discuss its applicability moving forward with real solutions. I'd also like to thank Dean McHenry for listening to our team's goals early on and providing us with guidance early on in the process. Second, I would like to thank our faculty and symposium advisor, Professor Hilary Hoffman, for being so integral in the vision that Vermont Law Review had for this special symposium. I'd also like to thank Jessica Dowdy, Vermont Law Review's business manager, Brittany Town, Vermont Law School's events coordinator, Bill Bond, and the rest of IT for setting up this great event, and Christine Saul, the executive assistant for the Environmental Law Center, for further helping the symposium team reach its goals. Third, I would like to thank Martina Rutkowski, Jeff Jones, and the rest of the CAFE staff for all their hard work on not only this event, but for constantly providing us students with delicious and healthy food each and every day. All of your efforts are known and appreciated. Finally, I'd like to thank Jeffrey Knudsen and the rest of Buildings and Grounds and the staff here at VLS for helping set up this room for this event and for always keeping our school as beautiful as it is. Thank you also to you all for being here, and to our 3L and 2L editors here on Law Review for helping set this entire event up and providing helping hands wherever needed. I hope you enjoyed today's event and walk away feeling like the Green New Deal can and will be achieved. I'd like to introduce the first panel, Decarbonizing the Economy, Using Policy to Realize the Renewable Future of America's Energy Industry, with Professor Kevin Jones, Director of the Institute for Energy and the Environment. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm very excited to introduce this wonderful panel that the Law Review staff has put together. And what we're going to do is each panelist is going to give their presentation. We're going to have questions at the end. So first, we have Professor Stephen Ferrey, who's a professor of law at Suffolk University Law School in Boston. He is also taught as visiting professor at Harvard Law School. In 2015, served here at VLS as our distinguished energy scholar. He's the author of 7 books on energy and environmental law, and he's published more than 100 law review articles on environmental and energy topics, including 4 articles in VLS journals. For the last 25 years, he has consulted on climate change issues for the World Bank and United Nations and many developing countries, working extensively in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Steve holds a JD degree and a master's degree from UC Berkeley and a BA in economics from Sonoma College. Between his 2 graduate degrees, he was a Fulbright Fellow at the University of London. So welcome, Steve. Second, we have Elizabeth McDonald here with us, who's just arrived early this morning from Australia via San Francisco. And Elizabeth leads SWS Lawyers, property and planning team, and has specialized in land and water law since 2006. She has degrees in law and economics and was awarded the first-class honors after completing a thesis in property and native title. Elizabeth lectures in leasing law at the University of Newcastle Law School and has specialist experience in property disputes, renewable energy projects, and access compensation agreements for major projects. She regularly acts for small to medium enterprises, family groups, private investors, property trusts, and public companies. And in addition, she has significant experience in acting for government clients and Aboriginal land councils. Most importantly, or most excitingly, Elizabeth is here with us for most of October, visiting VLS, and is going to be housed over at Eaton House with us, working with our energy clinic, and she's here as part of an Endeavor Executive Leadership Award. So welcome to VLS, Elizabeth, and we look forward to spending more time with you. And finally, Jonas Monast, and Jonas is the C. Boyd and Gray Distinguished Fellow at the UNC School of Law and directs the Center for Climate, Energy, Environment, and Economics. His work focuses on climate change mitigation, aligning energy and environmental policy goals, and the intersection between natural resources law and emerging technologies. Prior to joining the Carolina Law faculty, Monast directed the Climate and Energy Program at Duke University, Duke University's Nicholas Institute for Energy Policy Solutions, and taught courses in energy and environmental issues at Duke University School of Law and the Nicholas School for the Environment. Jonas has also worked as an attorney in the corporate social responsibility practice at Foley Hoag LP, as a congressional fellow for the late Senator Paul Wellstone, and as a legislative counsel for the Center for Responsible Lending. Jonas received his BA from Appalachian State University in 1995 and his JD in 2002 from Georgetown University Law School. So welcome, Jonas. And Stephen's going to begin.
Okay. Thank you very much, Kevin. It is great to be back here. This is a fabulous program that you've got here that Dean McHenry and Dean Rushlow have put together. So it's fabulous to be back, and I have an interesting chore this morning, which is to talk about whether the Green New Deal is legal. So it's going to be an interesting question. I want to highlight 4 recent Supreme Court cases that are relevant. I want to talk about the policy. I want to talk about the lawsuits that will be coming, and I want to separate the green from the New Deal in Green New Deal here. And then for the last 5 minutes, I want to talk about how we can get around what are going to be some significant challenges to it, assuming it gets enacted. So again, I think it was described by Dean Rushlow a few minutes ago, but basically we've got the Green New Deal. The green parts are that we're going to cut to net zero carbon emissions in 10 years, meet 100% of the power demand, electric power demand in the U.S. through clean, renewable, and zero-emission energy sources. And Ocasio-Cortez also added that they want to get to net zero here within 10 years, and talked about some other factors here that may be hard to manage. So let's talk about the New Deal part. So the green part is to go 100% green. The New Deal part is guaranteeing a job for everybody and guaranteeing economic security whether people choose to work or don't choose to work. And I think it's important to separate those two as we walk through and decide how the litigation is going to probably formulate itself. So the revenues, again, there's no separation yet between the green and the New Deal, but I think there's a substantial chance that they're going to try to do a lot of this through the electric rate sector. Now, why do I say this? Obviously, the green part would be done through green electric power, green energy, and so that's a fairly obvious connection. Vice President Biden, candidate Biden, said that there's not enough money in some of the other candidates' proposals, even apart from the Green New Deal, to reach this. So he, in the most recent debate, said we're $1 trillion short on Senator Warren's plan, et cetera. So the revenues are hard to find in various places for all the things we're going to do. The second largest chunk of government influenceable cash in the country is electricity rates. Electricity revenue, which is almost $400 billion a year, is larger than all the corporate tax revenue garnered in the United States, even before the corporate tax rate a year and a half ago was lowered from 35% to 21%. So more revenue flows through electric utilities than flows through even the highest levels of corporate tax we've ever had. The only thing that's larger in terms of government revenue, putting aside the deficit that we run each year, the only thing that's larger is the personal income tax. And obviously, raising that it becomes politically its own issue. So it's the second largest source of cash. And again, so that's probably going to get reached here. Our president has said this is going to eliminate, this Green New Deal will eliminate all planes, cars, and cows. Again, 9 of the 10 top-ranked Democratic candidates for president have endorsed the Green New Deal. So there's a substantial chance that it moves forward under various scenarios here. Only Vice President Biden has suggested we need something different that is a middle ground course, and AOC responded there is no middle ground, and this is a lack of leadership. So obviously this is very policy charged all the way around. Ernest Moniz, Obama's Secretary of Energy, said we can't get there in 10 years. So again, there's a debate as how fast we can move, but there's not a major debate that we need to move. The question is whether we can do it in 10 years. So why the electric sector? I'm going to talk about the electric sector here, not only because it's the largest source of cash out there, but also this was former Mayor Bloomberg of New York and former Governor of California until quite recently, Jerry Brown's proposal in November or December of this past year. And the bar on the left, the sort of gray bar on the left, is carbon emissions. The blue second bar in is how much more they're going to be in the next year or two until we enact the Green New Deal. And then the other sectors, which I think you're probably too far away from to read, show the different sectors of the economy through which they propose to get it. The sort of beige or brown bar in the third position is electric power. Electric power, which is less than 28% of the total cause of carbon, they propose bears more than 60% of all the change. So this is going to be a sector of the economy that's going to be targeted. We're doing it here already. Foreign governments are also targeting electric power. Transportation, which is as large or larger than electric power, gets one of those tiny little slices to the right. It's, I think it gets the 1, 2, 3, 5th bar across there. So we're going to target electric power. So let's talk about at the federal level, at the state level, why some aspects of this are going to be difficult. Litigation will immediately follow this, of course. So let me just talk first about what is going to be disincentivizing renewable energy. The federal production tax credit, PTC, and the investment tax credit are ending or phasing down this year. Those have supported most of the solar and wind projects, which are going very well in the United States. Again, for 10 years, wind has been the most developed new energy source among all power sources in the United States. Those are phasing down the production tax credit, which wind power uses, which for 10 years gives 2.4 cents per kilowatt hour, which is more than 50% bonus on the value of the power itself, to wind projects, is phasing out this year. It's phasing down and out. The investment tax credit, which solar uses, starts phasing down this year from 30% of your capital investment back from the government in year 1. It's phasing down to 10%. So probably this is easier to see from back there with a graph here, maybe easier to see. But basically, the sort of green line in the middle going across is the investment tax credit going from 30% this year down to 10% 3 years later. And the production tax credit for wind is that bottom line. It goes down to 12% at the end of this year and then is gone. And there's no immediate prospect for reauthorizing that, although we'll see. I want to tell you about 3 Supreme Court cases in the last 4 years that make some aspects of the Green New Deal more difficult to implement at the federal level. So the first thing is the UARG case from 2014. This involved CO2 emissions. And all 3 of these first cases are during the Obama administration, and it was before the 2 recent appointees to the Supreme Court, which may change the complexion even more. But in the UARG case, the EPA, on regulating CO2 climate warming emissions, decided to try to tailor a little bit the way it regulated. And so instead of regulating, as the Clean Air Act says, anything from emitting more than 100 or 250 tons per year, they said that's too many things to regulate regarding carbon. We'll regulate and get information only from those with over either 75,000 or 100,000 tons per year emissions. So they changed the metric. The Supreme Court said you can't do that. You can't tailor it. You have to take verbatim what is in the law. There is not administrative discretion, at least on CO2 and at least with the EPA, which was the defendant in all 3 of these Supreme Court cases. You cannot sculpt this absent a congressional action. The second case is that a year later is the Michigan versus EPA case, an opinion by Chief Justice Roberts. This also was regulating CO2 emissions by coming after coal plants for their mercury emissions, but what it would do is it would have closed down a lot of the coal plants, which would have allowed more renewables to substitute. And in this case, even though that part of the Clean Air Act does not say you have to consider costs, the Supreme Court said it is not rational for you to regulate anything without first considering cost. There is a cost equation in our economy. And they struck the EPA's regulation, which was really a carbon initiative of the Obama administration. And here for the Clean Power Plan, which has been on hold, all the red states, which are more than half the states, challenged the Clean Power Plan, which was going to disincentivize coal, incentivize renewables, which we need to do to go to a green economy. And what the Supreme Court did in the West Virginia case a year later in 2016, again, all during the Obama administration, is it did something it had never done in 225 years of history of the Supreme Court. It blocked an entire regulation before an appeal got to it. So this particular challenge to the Clean Power Plan had not been substantively decided by the D.C. Circuit at that time. The D.C. Circuit failed to enjoin it. It went on appeal, the failure to enjoin the regulation to the Supreme Court, and having no opinion to say, well, we disagree with this part of the opinion or that part of the opinion, they said, we're going to enjoin the entire administrative regulation indefinitely. And as far as we know, no one else in the at oral argument could think of a situation where that had ever happened again. So these are all EPA cases. This is a carbon regulation, all three cases. And so the federal government has been trimmed back in terms of its Chevron deference to regulatory action, and certainly by the EPA or on carbon issues. So again, there's a bright line here between federal power over all wholesale transactions, state power exclusively over all retail transactions in the electric power sector. There's nothing else in the US economy that's regulated that way, and there's nothing else in the world economy regulated with a wholesale retail split the way we regulate electric power. A couple of cases here, I won't discuss them in the interest of time, that have upheld that in the Supreme Court. One from next door here in New Hampshire, in the New England Power case, saying you have to respect these divisions. So again, I mentioned here there's FERC orders out there. FERC is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission exercising the federal authority. They and EPA would have to implement the Green New Deal. And there are a series of regulations. 719 says we're going to procure the cheapest wholesale power out there. Orders 888 and 890 say we're going to open up the transmission system for at fair rates for wholesale power. Order 1000 tries to incentivize the transmission system out there. Basically, we're buying least cost power. It raises the question, will renewables be able to compete on least cost power? I'd argue they probably can, but that becomes an issue here under the last 85 years of federal law. And it would be one of the challenges, I suppose. Okay, let me, here's the another 2016 case of Hughes versus Talon Energy. In that, it was upheld either 8-0 or 9-0, I forget which, by the Supreme Court. A state was trying to encourage certain kinds of power in its state. The Supreme Court said you can't do that because you're meddling or tethering this to wholesale rates. You can't do that. So even state power is being trimmed back. Justice Kagan says, I'm not sure when you say it was subject to FERC's jurisdiction, that doesn't end the case right there against you. You're preempted. So with these four cases, the federal power is somewhat less. So the question is, do you try to implement this through state power? Real quickly here, the solar resources are different in every state. And so whether solar is popular or unpopular in a particular state will not be uniformly agreed to by all 50 states. This is where the wind is. The excess of wind is in the plains and off the coast primarily. Not every state has these resources in equal abundance. That's not bad that there'll be various models out there, but the states are of different opinions on being told by the federal government to implement things. I'm going to skip this slide, but basically this shows that other than hydro, geothermal is the major resource in California and Nevada. Biomass is the major resource in the South. And wind is the major resource most other places. So there is some divergence. So again, in terms of, can you push this through the states is my second point here before I turn to a possible solution. So if we do this, again, in Hughes versus Talon Energy 2016 Supreme Court case, the states have somewhat restricted power in terms of what they try to do with rates that are wholesale rates. 30 years ago, only 8% of US power was sold wholesale from some entity to a utility to then retail it to you and me. Today, because of all the deregulation led by New England, with having utilities divest and sell their power plants, wholesale sales are over 40%, heading to 50%, and will soon be more than half. That takes away all state authority over those wholesale transactions and makes it exclusively federal, subject to, again, some constriction at the federal level by the Supreme Court. In FERC versus Mississippi, a 1982 Supreme Court case upholding the Public Utility Regulatory Policies Act, which gave incentives for renewable energy. In that case, the court held out that you cannot mandate to a state any substantive element in terms of setting retail rates. So the federal government can tell you you have to consider something, but they cannot make a state adopt at the retail level any sort of a rate that incentivizes renewables or conservation or anything else. And that's, that case has also been upheld. So what happens with the New Deal aspects? Let me focus on the New Deal side. Again, we're trying to possibly use the electric system to create greater equity among ability to pay, different population groups, different groups located in different areas. If you do this, it is not every state, but a number of states in their state constitutions have interpretations under precedent that electricity is a commodity, and the same party has to pay the same amount. There has to be vertical equity and horizontal equity. You cannot discriminate based on things like ability to pay for this power. So again, I've got some quotations here from different states. Undue or unjust discrimination among wholesale or retail customers is prohibited. These are out of different state opinions. Massachusetts is the only Supreme Court in the country that has authorized and validated discrimination in rates based on income. A few other states do it, but it's usually by regulatory orders, and it's not reached their Supreme Court. So the majority of states would prevent, as a state matter, implementation of, through the electric system of, I guess we have an equity panel this afternoon. I guess I'll call it equity concerns coming to the fore. So the New Deal elements are questionable, but the green elements are certainly doable. So let me try to move in my last 5 minutes through the back door as to how you do this. The federal tax credits are disappearing. If you don't start construction by this year, they're either phasing way down or phasing entirely out for renewable energy. There are some solutions, at least on the green side. I think the New Deal side needs to be implemented through traditional welfare or assistance programs, and probably not through the electric system in most states or federally. So again, if there are barriers to the New Deal stuff, how do we get the green stuff going? The opening is in two places. One is the new FERC Order 841. It requires that the independent system operators, so ISO New England, which regulates the wholesale and transmission transactions in the 6 New England states. About half the states are in these independent system operators. They now have to consider storage as a viable option and incentivize storage. Storage here on this graph on the left, the big piece of the pie on the left is where our storage is. 95% is in pumped hydro. Only a small amount, 5% or so, is in batteries and compressed air and thermal storage. But batteries are making a huge change here, and with cheaper battery storage, it changes the entire complexion of electricity. Again, electricity is the only energy resource we can't store. We don't store it as electricity, we change it back to chemical energy, or we lift water back to the top of the dam and store it as kinetic energy. We cannot store it as electric energy. So these technologies become essentially very important. Make sure I keep this moving here, and I'm done in a couple minutes. Here's a second big change. This is the decrease in wind prices. Wind is now pretty close to cost competitive with natural gas. It's not quite there yet, but it's right on the edge. Not having these tax credits makes a huge difference, though, on the edge. Here's the decrease in solar prices. It goes to about 1% of what it was 30 years ago. And so this is, as of 2013, it was down to 74 cents per watt for a solar panel. 1 year later, it had fallen in half again to 36 cents. With the Trump tariffs on Chinese panels and other things that are now, that 36 cents is up to about 45 cents. So it's back up a bit, but it's not back up much. So both these technologies are just in the market making some incentive. So that's a rooftop in Lawrence, Massachusetts. That's 3/4 of a megawatt on a rooftop. We can do a lot of solar. This is the transmission network. And for my last slide, this is my lead into my last slide. The transmission network and the smaller distribution network traverses most of the United States. There is a small provision that has nothing to do with renewable energy that's in the tax law changes that occurred effective in 2018. And it's not designed for solar and wind, but it is going to save solar and wind if you as lawyers implement it this way. So in the 2017 tax law changes, they created something called opportunity zones. In an opportunity zone, if you take capital gains from an investment, you sell stock, you sell real estate, you sell bonds, whatever it is you're selling, if you invested in one of these opportunity zones and you keep it there in this geographic zone for at least 5 years, 10% of the gain becomes untaxable. If you keep it for 7 years there, 15% of the capital gain becomes totally untaxable. If you keep it for 10 years, the entire capital gain becomes untaxable. So you avoid capital gains tax, which certainly some of the presidential candidates say we have to raise because we're not taxing those sufficiently. It becomes totally tax-free. There are 8,700 of these zones in every state. So again, to the degree we still have federal tax credits which are expiring, it can be combined with those. In these zones, essentially, because the transmission lines cross the entire country, while it's maybe risky to invest in a traditional investment in an opportunity zone because it's a depressed zone, it's either rural or urban, but either way it's depressed, you can put solar, you can put wind in a lot of these zones. You can put storage capacity in these zones. And wind and solar and the batteries last for more than 10 years. It makes the entire investment tax-free from your former capital gains. Again, this has nothing to do with renewables, but it has everything to do with renewables. So that, I think, is going to substitute for this if you as lawyers and business people start transitioning this and you produce the power there renewably, you use the lines that are there to bring it into the Bostons and the Hartfords and the New Yorks and the places that need it. So I think there is a solution here. So my time is up. I'll save any questions for questions and answers. And after Elizabeth speaks, I know Jonas, Kevin will introduce Jonas and we'll be able to continue some of the same stuff. So good.
Thank you, Steve. Elizabeth?
I'm a huge Owen Wilson fan, by the way, so thank you for that.
Can I talk from here? Great. Oh, thank you. I haven't had a lot of sleep, so. Just Newcastle, New South Wales. This one. You get the point. So look, I'm from Newcastle in Australia, and I just wanted to show you a bit of a picture of where I'm from because that's really relevant to what I wanted to talk to you about today. Newcastle is on the east coast of Australia. It's 2 hours north from Sydney, and it's the sixth biggest city in Australia. And I wanted to tell you a little bit about my story from Newcastle, a bit about my town, because I think it's really relevant to some of the policy issues in respect of a just transition to clean energy. So Newcastle is on Awabakal land. They're the Aboriginal traditional owners of the land. And whenever I talk about Newcastle, I like to acknowledge their elders past and present. Newcastle is the gateway to the Hunter region, and the Hunter is Wonnarua land. Also acknowledge their elders past and present. I do a lot of work with the First Nations people in Australia, and in that space, there's some really exciting, I think, opportunities for clean energy, but there's some really big challenges as well. Let's grab a, sorry. So Newcastle's a really beautiful place. It's also synonymous with coal in Australia. So in terms of my family came to Newcastle as first settlers, white first settlers from the UK. And the reason why first settlers chose Newcastle was because it was a really coal-dense place in terms of kind of setting up settlement in Australia. That was a great opportunity. When you hear the word Newcastle in Australia, coal is what comes to people's minds. So everyone that I know has some connection with coal. People live there. It's a beautiful place to live, but people can afford to live there because they're employed by the coal industry. I'm not employed by the coal industry, but I've worked for clients. You know, a lot of my clients have some connection with coal. There are people that are doing some really interesting things in Newcastle. There are engineers that are taking their experience from coal mines and now rebadging it for the clean energy industry. There are a lot of those kind of clean energy experts that are popping up, but I would say for the majority of people, they're scared about the transition, and I think Newcastle and the Hunter tends to be a place where politicians make policies about, and they don't make policies with. What I think is interesting about the Green New Deal, what I think is interesting around the climate movement at the moment, is the community-led aspect. And I think in order for this movement to be successful, it needs to be community-led. So in Newcastle, for example, rather than decisions being made about what's taken out of the ground, how energy is created, those decisions being made from a central location, which is either Sydney or Canberra in Australia, those decisions need to start being made by the people, because once people, the local communities, understand those decisions, they can drive those decisions and have ownership of those decisions. That's when I think we'll see real change. And that's a really big policy shift, and it's a really big change for government to allow that divestment of control, but I think it's the key thing that will make that change. So to give you a bit of a picture, there's two coal-fired plants in the Hunter region, where I'm from. There's a variety of coal mines. Some are open cut, some are underground. When you fly over Newcastle, or when you fly over the Hunter, it's really confronting, because there are some massive holes that will never be fixed by the mining companies, because they're not required to fix those holes. So locals have learnt to live with that, and while they would prefer mining not to be there, the reality is that mining is there, and they can afford to have the lifestyle that they have because of the mining companies. I think when I talk to people, and other co-advisors talk to people, and people in community energy talk to locals about what is possible now with clean energy, people are really excited by it. There are some interesting community power projects happening in Newcastle. I have a client who small business owner who has bought a vineyard as part of their retirement plan. They're going to sell their life's work and live on this vineyard, and they are developing a sustainable business there. They're developing a cellar door which will be completely solar powered. Their grapes will be stomped by women, so that when they sell their wine, it will be grown and made and produced by women, and then you'll buy it from this solar-powered cellar door. So the people that are excited about what is possible and marketing their businesses in a sustainable way. We have entrepreneurs who've come to Newcastle for the Clean Tech Hub, and they're creating really interesting, really innovative technology that then tends not to be able to be developed in Australia, and they end up in Silicon Valley developing it. But there's some really interesting things happening. What I think is really missing is that I think that education piece of bringing local communities along for the ride. And then once local communities know what is available from a policy perspective, I think what is missing is creating ways for communities to participate in the clean energy transition. So in Australia and here, microgrids have an enormous potential for some of the remote and rural communities, but from a legal framework perspective in Australia, we're really struggling to get to a point where we can make that work. From a technology perspective, it works, but from a legal framework, it's different in every state. There's no consistency, and there's little policy around how we can make that a realistic opportunity. And for those communities, those rural and remote communities, energy security is really important. So if we can get that policy piece right, then they have energy security, they have protection in relation to blackouts, and some certainty in relation to future prices. I also wanted to give an example of one of the Aboriginal communities that I work with. It's a community in far western New South Wales. To give you an idea, it's probably about a 12-hour drive from any big city, and it's half the year the temperature would be over 100 degrees. For about 3 months of the year, it'd probably be pushing 120. So really inhospitable kind of place to live. It's an area where there's some really big social problems with the general population, not just with the Aboriginal community. There's a drug issue. There's an unemployment issue. The Aboriginal Land Council in that area are really proactive, and they want to create opportunities for their people. They want to allow people to be able to live and work on country. Generally, their people have had to go away to get jobs, or if they've stayed, they've struggled to get jobs. They see clean energy as part of their solution. In their area, they struggle to get affordable fresh fruit and vegetables because they are so far away, and because the temperature is crazy, it is hard to grow. So one of the ideas they've come up with is a solar-powered greenhouse, where they would employ some locals to grow fresh fruit and vegetables, which would then be available at heavily discounted rates for their members. The challenge for them is they're very far away from anyone. So in terms of actually accessing skills, their opportunity is limited. B, while they have land, they don't have very much in the way of funds to develop this idea. And C, there's no clear policy to support them to do something like that. And if they haven't done that kind of thing before, so they're nervous that if they did go about it, well, how do they choose a good partner to do this with? How do they choose the right advisors to do this with? So for this community, they're fortunate in that they've found a couple of advisors, including myself, who are happy to do it for free and who have some experience in the space. But many communities don't have that opportunity to get that kind of access. Now, I think it's these projects that need to drive, that at the moment we have in Australia, 17% of our electricity is generated from clean sources. So and that's generally happened through some government tools, but often through market forces. But the market is not going to go into communities and assist them to develop their own projects. In fact, the discussions that I've had with most of the clean energy developers are that they're nervous about getting involved in community projects because community projects are complex. There are governance aspects, and there's delays, and there's all those things that come with working with communities, which is true. I've worked with a lot of communities, and you do have to allow for longer timeframes for consultation, because unless you bring the whole community along for the ride and engage them, and unless they feel like they're owning the project, then there's no point in getting to the end. You know, when you get to the end, it doesn't yield the result that you want. So I think I think I can see why developers are nervous. It is not an investment model that makes the most economic sense compared to what else they have available. That's where I think there's a huge government policy need, probably, and I suspect there's a very similar need here in the US. In fact, I suspect there's a very similar need through most countries to bring, to support those communities to make their own decisions. So our Aboriginal traditional owners, they see having these clean energy projects as a fantastic way to use their land in a way that is in line with their historical land use. It's a sustainable way for them to create opportunities for their people to continue that long-standing connection with the land. This is their country, this is the land of their ancestors. It is important that they keep those connections. And I think as policy, from a policy perspective, we need to do everything we can to allow these communities to take, to have access to the technology, to have access to the resources, and then to drive things for themselves. And as the reason why I'm really interested in this space, I think, is as someone from Newcastle and from a coal background, I want the people making policy about my region to be from the region. I think it's really important that the decisions are not just influenced by what someone in a capital city thinks, but is influenced by people who grew up in a coal town, whose parents came home every day. They could never scrub the black coal out of their fingerprints because they had spent their entire day underground. I mean, that is as a kid, we went through coal mines. That's the story of my town. It's the story of, my ancestors in the Hunter. And I think these are the people that need to be, having a say in relation to the policy. Thanks.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Jonas?
Good. I think I'll stay here as well. That was fascinating. Thank you. So I, first off, want to thank the students who put this together, and Sarah in particular, just incredible attention to detail to make all of this smoothly, at least for those of us that flew in to be a part of this conversation. So thank you. And I always enjoy coming to Vermont. What an important conversation. I think a lot of times, law professors, our job, our kind of approach to questions like a Green New Deal is to focus on the details almost immediately and think critically about it. And I will certainly do some of that during my talk here. But I want to start by just acknowledging the tremendous impact that the Green New Deal has already had on the climate policy debate. And I think it is largely responsible for fostering what I think is the most constructive conversation about climate policy that we've had at the federal level since the Waxman-Markey bill. And for those of you that have worked in DC on policy issues, you'll appreciate that controlling the narrative is such an important part of achieving policy. And that's not just true in Congress, but that's also true for those of us that try to engage with stakeholders that have different viewpoints about some of the most vexing environmental policy challenges of the day. If you don't have that forcing mechanism, if people are stuck on the question of should we do something instead of how should we do something, then it becomes very, very difficult to make progress. And I think the Green New Deal, the folks who put it together, I think, very wisely have forced us into some conversations about how should we, right? So many of us, when we saw carbon neutral by 10 years, the immediate reaction was, well, you can't do that, right? And Steve put up some quotes of experts that were saying that. But, right, and if the question had been, should we move aggressively and take climate change seriously, then Ernie Muniz and everybody else would have said yes, right? We all agree on that. If the question is, can we do it in 10 years? And if those of us who've been working in this space for a while say no, right, then that puts us in a position, well, if not 10, then what? And if not 10, if we can't do it all in 10, how much can we do in 10? And that's a very different question to start with. I think also the Green New Deal kind of forcing us to grapple with the fact that, environmental policy, the traditional approach to environmental policy, right, we see too much pollution coming from a smokestack, so enact a policy that restricts the amount of pollution that can come out of a smokestack. And from the legal perspective, rely on other policy silos to deal with some of the impacts of, well, plants might shut down, people might lose their jobs, right? Deal with that from another policy perspective by talking about the social and the environmental in one conversation rather than as distinct conversations, I think is also tremendously powerful and can only help us get to a meaningful climate solution, but also recognizing that even today, without something enacted called the Green New Deal, we are shutting down power plants and shutting down mines across the country, and people are losing their jobs. Should we think of that as an energy policy problem? Also, we're going to be building a lot of new things, right? Whether we have a Green New Deal enacted into policy or not. Pipelines are being built. Wind farms are being built in North Carolina, incredibly controversial. We have one large wind farm, and we've had since that large wind farm went into operation, we've had a moratorium on wind because people in the eastern part of North Carolina, at least some people in the eastern part of North Carolina, would like to not look at wind turbines, right? So there's communities that may have new energy infrastructure going in that may or may not be supportive of that new energy infrastructure. And a big question is, how do you make sure where we're building new things, how do you make sure that that's done in a way that's not just good for all of us, but also good for the people who are living next door to that infrastructure? I think at the same time that the Green New Deal has opened up the space to grapple with some of these questions, it's also exposed some really fundamental disagreements that we have about climate policy. And in fact, if we contrast the Green New Deal with the other kind of major policy approach that was also being proposed at the time, or at least being advocated at the time, which is a revenue neutral carbon tax. So creating a price on carbon, so emitters pay a price on carbon, but rather than that coming to the government and staying in the government coffers, recycling it back out and giving it back to the consumers, because ultimately the price on carbon filters down to make the things that we consume more expensive. So if we contrast those two, if we take the folks that are advocating the revenue neutral carbon tax at their word that they're looking for an effective solution to mitigate climate change, I think that some of the most consequential disagreements between the advocates of a revenue neutral carbon tax and the Green New Deal and everywhere on the spectrum in between those two, the most consequential arguments are not about climate change. They're really about fundamental questions about the role of government. And I think kind of exposing those questions and making sure that we grapple with those questions so that disagreements about the role of government doesn't frustrate the ability to get the broad coalition that would be necessary to meaningfully grapple with climate change is necessary. So I think I kind of break this down in three categories. Well, actually, before I get there, right? Climate policy can mean transportation policy, climate policy can mean ag policy, climate policy can mean international relations policy, climate policy can mean energy policy. So it's running up against a lot of established areas of the law. But I think the fundamental disagreements break down, in my mind, on three levels. One is the role of decarbonization in setting technology policy, right? Do we care about what the low carbon energy mix looks like? Our panel here is using policy to realize the renewable future of America's energy industry, right? So do we care that it's renewable or do we care that it's clean? And I think that distinction, right? So clean can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. There used to be a debate about whether you could have something called clean coal. Back in the in the 1990s, natural gas was the clean natural gas. We're going to be moving away from dirty fuel to clean natural gas. Now, right, clean for some means no fossils at all. For some, clean means including nuclear, and for some, clean means including carbon capture and storage. So whether it's natural gas or whether it's coal, as long as you're capturing the CO2 before it mixes in the atmosphere and contributes to climate change, then that's enough. The role of government, should we be picking what the energy mix looks like, or should we be creating price signals and say, don't emit carbon, now private sector go figure it out, I think is a fundamental question. A second big question is the role of the government in considering social justice. And I'm really looking forward to our equity panel this afternoon. But I think one of the challenges with social justice is if we did a survey in this room about what does social justice mean and how should we incorporate that into the energy sector, there would probably be a lot of disagreement about how we were defining social justice. I think the framework of just transition helps a lot. But I think that just the lack of a common understanding about what that means makes it difficult to begin with. But again, there's also a viewpoint that we should be, climate change is an existential crisis and is hard enough, and we should focus on that problem and deal with some of the social impacts somewhere else. To the extent that there are hardened positions on that, and that makes it difficult to get a broad-based coalition to deal with climate change, that could affect our ability to see something that we would call a Green New Deal enacted into law. I think that the third real disagreement is the role of climate policy as fiscal policy. We've already heard today that the Green New Deal will be very expensive. That money's got to come from somewhere. Should climate policy be designed as in part to generate revenue that is helping the communities that are losing jobs, generate revenue to create the incentives to build the energy future that we need to build? Or should climate policy just be about reducing a class of pollutants and not creating more, quote unquote, big government, not expanding the coffers of the federal government? And there too, fundamental disagreements, and then fundamental disagreements that go much deeper than disagreements about whether we should be dealing with climate change or not. So I wanted to put that on the table, but now I want to pivot to where decisions are being made today. So regardless of what happens at the federal level and where the Green New Deal debate goes on the federal level, our energy system is changing. It's changing incredibly rapidly. For a sector like electricity. If we think of 2050 as like the electricity sector of 2050 is a blank sheet of paper, basically almost every part of the electricity system that we have today is going to be replaced with something by 2050. And if we think of that as a blank sheet of paper, we're starting to fill out that blank sheet of paper with the choices that we're making right now. So as the electricity sector is shutting down coal-fired power plants, and in some parts of the country shutting down nuclear power plants, what we replace those retiring plants with is going to have a big influence on how quickly we can move aggressively to deal with climate change. I was just in North Carolina, Duke Energy, I think it was just last week, came out publicly with a net carbon neutral pledge. So the plan, I think, is 40% reduction by 2030 and net carbon neutral by 2050. A 40% reduction by 2030 and 100% carbon neutral and 100% renewables, if that's what you think we need to do. Very, very different, right? And in a lot of ways, I think what Duke Energy included in their net carbon neutral plan through 2030 is the easy stuff. Basically, that's all stuff they're going to do anyway. And they're not going to, they're going to do it, and I don't want to speak for the executives there. I'll just say it this way. Regardless of interest in climate policy, the economics are leading Duke Energy and other large utilities to reduce carbon emissions. The reason that it's the easy stuff is getting to 40% is shutting down a lot of remaining coal and replacing that with natural gas. That's why it's 40%. Rather than something more aggressive. The question about what happens between 2030 and 2050 depends in part on technology, what's available to reduce carbon emissions, but it also depends on what the Utility Commission in North Carolina and in the other states where Duke Energy operates allows Duke Energy to do. What will the Utility Commission, so a state body that sets rates for the monopoly utility, what will they allow the monopoly utility to invest in and recover through rates? So I should say, to be more precise, Duke Energy can invest in whatever it wants to, but Duke Energy is going to invest in the types of things that it's going to be able to recover through rates. And utility commissions in many states across the country are therefore going to be playing a very direct role in climate policy, are playing a very direct role in climate policy. Also, I say Duke Energy is not the only large utility that's made these net carbon neutral commitments. Southern Company, which operates in Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, they don't call it net carbon neutral, they call it low to no carbon by 2050. Which I think we could probably interpret as basically meaning the same thing. Xcel has, NextEra has, so there are a lot of these large utilities that are making these commitments. Whether or not they can do so, again, depends on the Utilities Commission. So I'm going to spend my remaining time here talking about utilities commissions and the opportunities that I think present themselves right now at this point in time where the electricity system is changing, at a point in time where low carbon investments are cost-effective investments, and how far utility commissions could go. So those of you that have taken energy law here, sure you will know at least the basics of rate setting and monopolies. Right, Kevin? Yeah, okay, good. So for those of you that haven't, right, so the Utility Commission has a few different mandates. One, make sure that the utilities are doing what it takes to keep the lights on. In North Carolina, we have hurricanes. Our electricity grids go down when there are hurricanes. We tend to be sympathetic when the lights have gone out for 2 days if there's been a big storm, but if it's longer than that, we start getting grumpy. If the lights go out and there hasn't been a hurricane, the lights just go out for some reason that we can't see it, we get really upset, right? So one, keep the lights on. Two, make sure that the public utility, which is a private company operating in the public interest, make sure that the public utility is able to attract investors, to make sure they can attract the capital that's necessary to keep that electricity system running, and then also protect consumers. The utilities are granted a monopoly so they don't face competition, so the check on the prices that the monopolies charge us comes through the Utility Commission. The utilities commissions, generally utility commissioners will describe themselves as the economic regulators. They focus on rates, they will say, right? But focusing on cost and focusing on the economics is not as limiting, I think, as many utility commissioners will try to convince you with the way that they describe their role and the way that historically utility commissions have interpreted their mandates. Utilities commissions, going back to the early 1900s, right? This is part of progressive policy. This is, the utilities commissions are making sure that these private companies that are serving a fundamental public purpose are doing so in the public interest. And it was the Utilities Commission's role to interpret what that public interest was. Courts, again, going back to energy law, so with the Hope Natural Gas case in the 1930s, that's where the Supreme Court said, we're not going to get, the courts are not going to get intimately involved in picking apart every single choice that utility commissions or the Federal Power Commission at the time was making about setting rates. Instead, we want to make sure that the end result of the rate setting process is just and reasonable. And if the end result is just and reasonable, we're not going to question with a lot of detail, we're not going to question each of the components that the Utilities Commission used to arrive at those rates. There are some dissents in that case that generally aren't included in the textbooks, but dissents in that case where, like, Justice Frankfurter is arguing that it is the court's role to make sure that the public interest is being protected. There's a social element to rate setting, and the courts need to make sure that the utility commissions are taking that public interest seriously, and the rates are set appropriately, not just based on economics, but based on a broader set of factors. So today, largely utility commissions view these questions of what utilities should invest in through the lens of cost, and they use a framework called the least cost framework. Why do they do that? Because if the utility doesn't have competitors and the utility is compensated, they get the rate of return based on the types of large capital investments that they make, there's a natural economic incentive there to invest in more capital, build more things, or if you're building things, build more expensive things, but if you get a rate of return that is just calculated based on how much the utility spent. So the Utilities Commission uses the lens of least cost to make sure that the utility is not gouging consumers, investing more and getting a rate of return on that higher investment when they don't need to do it. Typically, least cost is interpreted as short-term, what's the law on the books today, what are fuel price projections on the books today, what are technologies available today. So least cost is focused on a moment in time, this moment in time. And if things change, many utility commissions will say, if things change, then we'll deal with that later. But especially with policy, we're not going to try to anticipate how policy may change. Stephen mentioned the mercury rule that had from the EPA that had the impact of shutting down a lot of coal-fired power plants. That process, I think, really helped utility commissioners realize if they don't anticipate the prospect of more stringent environmental regulation in the future, there is a direct cost to ratepayers, right? If you haven't anticipated that, if you wait until that rule is in place, then you may be forcing higher costs on your ratepayers over the lifetime of a power plant than if you had considered least costs in a broader framework. So one point, I think, for bring this back to the Green New Deal and renewables and clean is there's a way to use existing law and the existing framework the utility commissions use right now to make decisions to move us to a lower carbon future just by taking risks and putting and monetizing it, putting in the language that utility commissions use. I think it's also possible to push utility commissions to have a much broader view of the public interest and not just be limited to using least cost as the primary metric for judging whether an investment is in the public interest or not. Utility commissions have a lot of discretion to consider economic development, right? So if we think about job losses or job gains, if we think about impacts on communities, if we think about burdens that we place on communities that are living next to power plants, health burdens, property burdens, utility commissions have much more discretion generally under the law to consider these things than they do right now. Utility commissioners will push back if you suggest that they should be environmental regulators, but it's possible to take a lot of the same concerns that we would be talking to environmental regulators about, use different language and talk to utility commissioners about. And the difference is the utility commissioners right now are having a direct impact on what utilities are willing to build. So back to whether Duke Energy is 40% lower carbon by 2040, or whether Duke Energy is 60 or 70% lower carbon by 2030 will depend in very large part on what state utility commissions will allow Duke Energy to invest in. So I think it's great, let's keep that the constructive conversation about climate policy at the federal level going, but also recognize that there are decisions that are being made right now that are going to lock in choices for a long time if we don't get it right. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jonas. So our panelists have not been only informative and engaging, but they've left us with plenty of time for questions. So. Well, yeah, go ahead.
Hi, I want to say thank you so much for being here. My question's for Professor Ferrey. You mentioned the opportunity zones, which is a fascinating concept, but something we're dealing with in Vermont is we have plenty of renewable energy generation, but we can't get it to where it needs to meet the load. And I'm wondering if you saw potential for opportunity zones to kind of work for that transmission concept, because that's generally a larger project that spans a lot of different zones.
Yeah, and I think probably not for that, because again, the opportunity zones, there's obviously a lot of money that has done well in the last few years, and people are going to be liquidating that, probably concerned about where the stock market's going and elections coming up. This is a geographic non-tax status on your income. The utility lines under Order 1000 of FERC, each state has to consider competitive transmission options now. Most of the states are not encouraging that particularly. They're sticking with the utilities doing it. And the utilities, as Jonas said, can pass all the costs through to ratepayers. So I don't see it helping there. The federal government tried to overcome state resistance to transmission about 10 years ago. They said there are a couple of areas of the country where it's really desperate to get power in. Basically, it was to New York. A fair bit of New York City is an island, right? And so getting power in there is tough. And the other one was Los Angeles, because it's growing so much, and they needed to move power in from often coal-fired power plants in Arizona and places. And so the federal government was given power to overrule a state decision in these couple of designated high priority zones for new transmission if the state did not reach a decision on new transmission. Two cases came up and both went to the federal circuit courts, and this is about 10 years ago, a little less than 10 years ago. The first one was one of the states, well, maybe I should back up one step. The states have a monopoly over all the hardware. So you cannot site a generating plant, whether it's coal or renewables or anything else, without state authority. The federal government cannot, the federal government deals with the pricing of the transactions over the network, but not the hardware. And trying to move power into New York, a state made a decision and said, we see no benefit. We're not letting these larger lines come through our state. And then also in the Los Angeles area, a similar thing happened. A state blocked transmission. And most recently, New Hampshire next door blocked Hydro-Quebec power coming down to Boston. And so now they're looking at routes through Vermont and other places to try to move that transmission line. In each of those two cases, the federal government overruled it. FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission in Los Angeles and New York, overruled it and said, you made the wrong decision. This is a high priority zone. And in each case, the circuit court said, you're misreading the law. The law says you can only act if the state refuses to make a decision, not if they make a decision you don't like. And in both those cases, and so the federal government has totally backed off transmission. So the hardware is an interesting aspect of this, because that is exclusively within state authority. And again, states have different appetites for renewables, different kinds of renewables. And I don't see, absent a state wanting to facilitate this, a state is a tremendous blockage in this division of separation of power that we have.
Thank you.
That's really, just to jump in, if that's okay, it's a really similar issue to what we have in Australia at the moment. So we need the states to work together in order to resolve the transmission issue. The final state, Queensland, has an excess of energy in the afternoons. There's a huge amount of solar. They can't get it to New South Wales because the transmission lines aren't wide enough to. So New South Wales is a net importer of energy. We can't bring in enough energy from Queensland. So at the moment, that energy is going to waste. And there's a policy question about, well, what do we do? Do we invest in transmission? Do we invest in storage? How do we resolve this? Then in New South Wales, as I said, where I'm from, there's a lot of transmission because there's a lot of coal-fired plants. In southwest New South Wales, there's a really great renewable energy zone. There's a lot of investment already, and there's other projects that are ready to go, but they won't start them because we don't have the transmission to get that energy outside of southwestern New South Wales. And unless those states work together to resolve that issue with the Commonwealth involved, with the privatised lines, the privatised owners of the lines involved as well, then we won't see any more investment in renewable energy because we've pretty much taken it to the end point that we can without better transmission.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming here. So my question is about the phasing out of the tax credits talked about. In those phasing out of tax credits, do you think it would make it easier for the legacy energy companies like the Exxon, the Shell to invest into renewable energy because of their experience with the long-term investment and then also their amount of capital that they have at their dispense?
Yeah, we see a lot of the traditional power companies that have dealt with fossil fuels now moving into renewable energy in a fairly significant way, both solar and wind particularly. So for example, there have been 5 federal leases for offshore wind granted off the Massachusetts coast. Each of those 5 companies, these are federally awarded leases because once you get outside the 3-mile zone, it becomes federal water out to 200 miles. And these are not, unlike Cape Wind, which is only exactly 3 miles away from Massachusetts and to get out of state control. These are about 20 miles out, and the horizon dips enough that supposedly you're not going to see the tops of these huge wind turbines. But in that case, we see some of the major energy companies moving into some of those leases. So, for example, 2 of the winning bidder, the bids are now being decided in Massachusetts as to which of these 5 wind projects out there in the ocean are going to be 1.6 gigawatts of Massachusetts offshore wind, which is a lot of wind for New England. That's a big project. And Eversource and National Grid are the 2 big utilities in New England, get to decide who they buy it from, with the state watching them. 2 of the 5 leases are 50% owned by Eversource. So each of these leases, the price was between $120 and $150 million for the leases. Now they've got to find an off-taker. So we see the companies moving in. We see both utilities. One of the other companies that owns the other lease is half owned by Shell Oil Company. So they're moving into this. And again, renewable power, I don't know, gas-fired power is probably somewhere in the vicinity of 3 cents a kilowatt hour, maybe in that vicinity to produce. Wind is at about 4 cents a kilowatt hour, which is very close. Solar is a little closer to 6 cents a kilowatt hour, but they're getting very close. With these federal tax credits, it makes a difference. If you use the opportunity zones, it makes a difference. They're close, but again, if we have the federal FERC decisions saying we've got 30 or 40 years of, now 30 years of decisions saying we purchase the least cost power in the region, to some degree, these entities are going to have to try to compete in cost. Although, again, each state can tell its utilities what kind of power it wants. So Massachusetts can say, we want 1.6 gigawatts of offshore wind. We want 12 gigawatts, or 1.2 gigawatts of something like Hydro-Quebec. The problem is you can't get the line down to carry it all down, so, yeah.
Can I ask a question? So, Elizabeth, I'm curious whether the Green New Deal, either, substantively or just kind of as rhetoric, has come to Australia, and if so, what that conversation looks like.
It's an interesting question. I think Australia tends to be, look, we're very far away from anyone and anything, and I think certainly, I think certainly in the I would say in the activist space, there's a lot of talk around that, and how we can incorporate aspects of it into Australian policy. I think generally speaking, we have most governments, a real vacuum in terms of government policy. No one is saying anything. No one in the federal government in Australia don't want to acknowledge that there's not going to be any new coal-fired plants in Australia. The reality is solar energy, even solar plus batteries, is more cost effective in Australia now, so it doesn't make sense. There will be no new coal-fired plants. The ones that are, there's many that are coming to end of life, that will be the end of, they will slowly phase out. So the economic reality is that the transition is happening regardless of the government, and I think as a result, I think there are people talking about this, but I think about things like the Green New Deal. But I think by and large, the market is just making it happen, and there's a limit around the policy in the space, which is a bit disappointing. I have a question for you actually, just in relation to I think the question about what is clean is really interesting, and in the battery storage, for example, in the battery storage, that being a huge opportunity in the future. So we have a massive uptake of residential solar, and I would say in the next 5 to 10 years we'll see a huge amount of people in Australia who are driving their EV, parking it in their garage, connecting it up to their house, and it will be the battery that will power, that will connect to their house. But then we have the question about batteries, for example. Are they clean energy? Because lithium comes from the ground, and interested in your thoughts around the future in that space.
Yeah, well, the very end of your question there, I mean, it just emphasizes that, in part, clean depends on how far down the value chain you're willing to look. So, I mean, lithium, getting a lot of lithium out of the ground in some ways moves the mining challenges from one geography where there's a lot of coal to another geography where there's a lot of lithium. So I don't know that I can answer the question about whether it's cleaner, whether getting lithium out of the ground is cleaner than getting coal out of the ground. But I think it does also raise a much larger issue, right? Which is once the lithium or whatever chemistry you're using for the battery is in the battery and is connected to the electricity system, whether or not that's playing a role to move towards a cleaner electricity system or not depends on what you're using to generate the electricity that's filling the battery. And batteries, in some ways, when we talk about battery storage, I kind of think of that as it's sort of the same as when you talk about smart grid, where you have to understand what somebody means when they're talking about it in order to be able to evaluate the impact it would have on the grid. Batteries can play a role in making sure the lights don't flicker, so very quickly responding to voltage problems on the system. Batteries can store energy for large system 4 hours at a time or so. So moving the solar generation from when the sun's shining to when we come home and turn on all of our appliances. So if that's the role that battery storage is playing, it certainly moves us to a more renewables future. But it's the role that batteries are going to play is going to depend on how the system is designed to use those batteries. So it certainly is an important part of a clean energy future, but just having batteries doesn't automatically get you to a cleaner energy future.
And batteries, I mean, 10 to 15-year lifespan, I guess. What's in the US? What happens with those batteries at the end of that lifespan?
That's a good question. I'm not sure.
I think right now I'm far outside of anything that I should be speaking about as an expert. So view this as like anecdotal knowledge that I've gained from reading Utility Dive. Right now, some of the batteries from early generation electric vehicles are being used in the electricity system because those, actually you could probably answer this question better than the rest of you. You're nodding your head vigorously. So in some, right, I mean, if you don't need the battery to perform like, at the high level we need to perform in a vehicle, but we need it to hold power and, and be cheap because they're recycled. They're basically, entering into a second life cycle. They can play a different role than we're expecting them to play. I don't know with the recycling once they've been fully depleted what we do with them. Do you know?
I think we haven't gotten there yet, and the nice thing is, given the life of the batteries, we haven't really had to deal with that problem, but the second use, the second life is really what people are thinking about now. I'm wondering if I can throw a question out to you guys. It's been one of my kind of pet peeves that I forewarned you about. We do a lot of work here at VLS in our energy clinic on trying to bring solar to underserved communities, low-income communities. Also do a lot of work with municipalities and schools. And right now, the main federal policy in the U.S. is the investment tax credit for solar. And one of the great things about the Green New Deal is that it has focused the debate not just on climate policy and clean energy policy, but on social justice and a just transition. And one of the things we found with the investment tax credit which is really just a subsidy. I mean, it's really just passing a cash grant to someone through the tax code. But one of the problems with it is you have to pay taxes to take advantage of it. But it's no different than if we gave out a cash grant to someone. It has the same effect on the U.S. Treasury. So one of the problems that we're finding with the investment tax credit is if you're working with schools, you're working with a municipality, you're working with low-income people in a housing development that either don't have a tax burden or don't earn enough to pay taxes, that we can't pass this major federal subsidy onto them without doing something where we're doing outside financing, bringing tax equity investors who want double-digit returns from that. And so what we're doing with our main federal policy is taking all this money that we're putting into renewable energy development, solar development, that could help schools and municipalities and communities and low-income people actually own a piece of the energy system. And we're forcing them to take on higher cost financing when they could go to their credit union. Obviously, schools and municipalities can borrow at very low rates, but they instead forego that, was 30% dropping down, being phased down after that. So it just seems to me like this is a tax policy and renewable energy policy that's been put in by the U.S. Congress, and we know who spends all the money to influence them, corporate America and the 1%. And what can we do, and what should we be doing? Shouldn't there be some more discussion about our federal policy so that we can take this subsidy that we provide and help more community ownership and more equity in this transition? And maybe, Elizabeth, you can address that from a Australian perspective too, if there's something similar there.
You want to start, or shall I? Okay. Yeah, that's an excellent question, and you're absolutely right. And again, tax equity financing, for all of you who are thinking 3Ls, thinking of your next job, law firms do this, and they basically bring in as, I don't want to say fictitious investors, but temporary investors, people who are in the top tax rate. So now that's less attractive now because the top corporate tax rate was 35% a year and a half ago. Now it's down to 21%. So there's been a dramatic cut. But typically it was some large banks that were in the banks and others that were in these high tax brackets would come in for 5 years. They'd look like they were an equity investor. They would get more or less 100% of the tax credits because they had income to offset it. But as Professor Jonas was saying, it's not a refundable tax credit. You've got to build a renewable project and run at a profit, which is hard because renewable projects are all upfront money. The wind project is upfront, the solar project's upfront, and then the operating costs are near zero because the wind blows and the sun shines. Let me just mention what Massachusetts does. And Massachusetts has not been challenged on this. I think if it did get challenged, it would be an interesting court case. But they incentivize equity in their solar program through the net metering program. That's gotten capped. We have 16% of each utility's peak is now net metered solar power back, which is a large percentage of a peak, which is more like 30% of the power on a day like today when we're not at peak time. But they basically give you kickers in the amount of net metering, and now the program's called the SMART program. We transitioned to a new name, but they basically give you a kicker both for land use and equity issues. So if you have the off-taker of, it's all done on paper. I mean, the electrons go wherever they want to go, but if you have the utility saying it's a low-income user to whom the net metering credits are given, and a net metering credit is you basically sell power that's only worth to the utility 4 cents, but you sell it at the retail rate. And my retail rate at Boston Edison is 26 cents a kilowatt hour. So there's a big leverage there. If you give it to a low-income entity, there's a kicker. You get more money out of the utility rates for it. So every low-income place in Massachusetts has gotten deluged over the last 2 or 3 years with phone calls from solar developers. Every low-income public housing project, every assisted elderly project, et cetera, has gotten calls saying, we'd like to sell you at a discount, basically a gift card to your utility in the form of net metered credits, and you can cancel the contract if you don't like it. So Massachusetts has done that. So there's social policy. But again, as I think I said earlier, Massachusetts is the only Supreme Court in the country that has said this is okay to take those sorts of equity, environmental equity or rate equity issues into account and do it. Some other states do it, but they do it through orders that have never gotten to their Supreme Court. So it's kind of unclear ultimately what would happen. The other thing, and let me just as a quick second aspect of the equity, you also get land use credits. So if you go into a green field now, you get less than the going rate for this. If you go into a distressed, like a quarry or a brownfield or on a landfill, a dump, you get a premium. If you go on a roof, you get a premium. If you go on a carport, a canopy, you get a premium for your solar. So that's caused an interesting problem in one of the major cities right next to Boston. A company came in, the city didn't realize what it was doing. They said, we're going to take the parking lot of all your schools and the parking lot of the library, and we're going to put these things up, and so the snow won't get on the cars. We're going to put these little canopies up. They get a 4 cent per kilowatt hour, which is a huge amount of money, kicker on the rate they get for net metering that power. And the community, the city, did not realize why they were doing it. They said, oh, we get a free parking structure. Now a couple of the aldermen, the city councilors of that city, have come to me and said, these things are really ugly. They're these plastic things that look like over a gas station that keeps the rain off while you're pumping your car, these little plasticky things. And so this community, which was trying to remain green and serene and beautiful, has got these things in the parking lot that they thought would be, well, maybe good, but they're designed sort of cheaply. So interesting questions as to what happens when you try to influence land use policy and or equity policy. If you do it right, it comes out well. But Massachusetts has done that. It's not been challenged as to does that break the equity, the equity aspects of this, and probably could be sustained in Massachusetts as okay to do. But your point's well taken. The tax credit is totally blind to where things go and who gets the revenue off of them. Opportunity zones, again, don't help the community much. They help a private investor who goes in there with money. So it's not fine-tuned to that yet.
It's really interesting, that tax incentive. So in Australia, there's rebates for solar rebates. So if you have excess solar and send it back to the grid, then you'll get some kind of rebate. 10 years ago, that rebate was quite high. Now the rebate's fairly low, which is probably appropriate given how much we have going back into the grid. There hasn't been a lot of, recently there's been a little bit of a change in policy in that space, but in the last 5 years, there's been very little policy around the fact that there's huge, obviously, substantial upfront costs to put solar into, schools or what have you. And if you don't have access to those funds, how do you do that? So there's a lot of community groups. It's a really common thing in terms of community groups who have taken upon themselves to develop their own community structures around that. And the most common one, which is in place in a lot of places in Australia, by no means everywhere, but I know of quite a number of communities who do it. They do like a crowdfunding, I guess, structure in their community. I'm not sure whether you have similar here, but they will start with everyone funding the school, for example, or a community centre to get solar panels there, and that school will bit by bit send some money back into that pool, and then they'll use it for other community structures and potentially for homes. So I would say in that space there has been very little policy around it, and it's been something that individuals and communities have tried to work out how this can benefit, how communities that do want to see clean energy happen throughout all of their public facilities, and they want it to be accessible to a range of income earners. What can they do together to make that possible? More recently in New South Wales, we've had some pilot projects in relation to making solar energy available to renters. But at the moment, the modelling is still that even with the government incentive, it's quite unaffordable for the renters. So you have to be 100% committed to clean energy to make that happen. And look, for some people that's great. They really are committed to clean energy, and they will go there. And so it's basically like a power purchase agreement style arrangement. But I would say for a lot of those people in that bracket, they don't have the they just don't have the funds to be able to make it work.
And of course, there's always a problem with renters, because renters, which are 30% of the population, and that's been growing recently with the economic transitions the country's been going through, they don't have the right to do anything on a landlord's roof. And so if you're individually metered and you have to pay your own bill to the utility, the landlord's sitting there saying, well, what's in this for me to spend money on the building?
Hey, Kevin, can I respond to your question with a question?
Sure.
Do you think that the value of solar proceedings that some states are engaging in is a way to get at that issue from a different perspective, right? So if we're valuing solar differently, then that can also create the economic benefit for other entities to install solar.
I think those things help. Obviously, anything you do to increase the payment, and in our clinic, we've been working in New Hampshire, and the legislature passed a low-income solar adder to there, which is going in place, but it still leaves out that big public policy piece, that big subsidy that the federal government's providing is, really siphoning off some of that value to essentially the 1%. So to me, I'm kind of surprised that at a national level that there hasn't been more focus on this to look at alternative mechanisms. Obviously, I support subsidies for solar, but it just seems like that's a subsidy that is typical to anything that goes to U.S. Congress was manipulated in a way that benefits a bunch of entities that we didn't maybe need to give a handout to in that process. But
Yeah, and there were some subsidies that helped municipalities a little bit in terms of tax-exempt financing, but that wasn't enough of a kicker to get most municipalities, which didn't have the capital to invest and were stretched. Yeah.
other questions? Still got a couple minutes, all right?
One to the left.
Hi, thank you. Great panel. The good news, maybe the only good news out of this panel, is reflected in the cost.
I look
curve.
like Owen Wilson.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The cost curves for solar power and wind power. I mean, incredibly dramatic reductions in cost. And I don't think any lawyers can take a lot of credit for that, maybe. But the question, so that's great. Economic forces are driving things, and if utilities prefer to go solar and abandon coal and achieve climate progress that way, totally painless from an economic standpoint, from a political standpoint, we all want to embrace that. I guess the concern I have is whether the potential Achilles heel of the movement towards renewables in the land siting arena. Here in Vermont and in many parts of the country, there are lots of local land use controversies over transmission lines. I mean, recently, the speakers have referenced the recent controversy in New Hampshire and siting of wind on ridge tops and large solar fields. Do you have any, I know this is a large, complicated question, but I'm just curious whether you have any thoughts on how to address that aspect of the challenge of moving towards renewables.
I think this afternoon JB Rule is probably going to talk about that in much more detail. That if the Green New Deal, if a big part of the Green New Deal is depends on infrastructure, there are a lot of laws in place and a lot of opinions about where we should build things. And generally, if we have the option of seeing energy infrastructure or not seeing energy infrastructure from our homes and communities, we choose to not see energy infrastructure. I'll just say, John, I don't know, I don't have a good answer, but the onshore wind debate that's taking place in eastern North Carolina, I think, is a really fascinating microcosm of it, because eastern North Carolina is a place where there's, companies aren't going in. There's not job growth in eastern North Carolina. The one wind farm that's there because Amazon has a server farm in North Carolina and wanted to get the electricity. It's generating a lot of local tax revenue that otherwise wouldn't be generated. So there's an argument that there are local benefits here. The opposition to it, and the wind moratorium will expire, I think, at the end of this year, and the legislature had tried, some advocates in the legislature had tried to extend the wind moratorium indefinitely. That didn't pass this year, but it'll come back up next year. It's partly about, they justify it as concern that putting up wind turbines will mean that our military bases are more likely to leave because they can't do training in eastern North Carolina, which the military has said that's not true, but nonetheless. But the fact that it's a landscape that is not an industrial landscape, and putting up wind turbines makes it look more like an industrial landscape. If you get the money from it, you may be supportive of it. If you don't get the money from it, but you have to look at it, then you may be opposed to it. And if you can get your state legislators to agree with you, then we end up not having wind in the entire state. So I think if the push really is renewables as, to the exclusion of other types of resources that we could call clean, and renewables take up a whole lot of land, then I think we'll be seeing those local conflicts more and more.
Can I give an example? I work with there's a company locally in Newcastle which the community group, or the community, the local community got together when they're, and often when the communities get together in relation to wind projects, they object to them. But this community sat down at the negotiation table with the wind farm developer, and they negotiated to share for the local owners to get the profits from one of the wind turbines. And as a result, because they're now investors, free investors in that one wind turbine, this community is really on board with the project because they feel like they have some ownership and they're investors. And I've spoken to the company about that, and they said they would never have. They were initially they opposed the idea. They didn't want that idea. They just wanted to cut them a check and walk away. But now that they would roll that out in every project because everything has, in terms of their approvals, that everything has gone through so much more smoothly. They haven't had any community issues because everyone there wants it to happen. So I think that's an example where companies and communities should be able to work together. And that gets the best outcomes.
I'm being told we're out of time, so we're extremely fortunate to have had these three panelists with us here today, so let's give them a big thanks.